Tonight, we look beyond politics into how Russian culture itself has become a weapon. Tanks in circuses, films turned into propaganda, and artists worshipped like generals. With us, historian and professor at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C., Peter Eltsov. Peter, hi. Long time no see.
Yeah, very nice to see you again, Natalia. Thank you for having me.
Peter, let's go straight to the point. Did you see one of the interesting scenes in Moscow last week? A tank rolling into a circus arena, greeted with applauses and children waving flags. And if you did, is this still a culture, or has Russian art finally merged with propaganda and performance?
Yeah, it definitely did. Today, one could argue that the entire identity of the country is war. Like everything is about war. You listen to the Russian news, usually for the first 20 minutes, they talk about their alleged successes in Ukraine. Then there's always a story, something about World War II and so forth. But this, I think, crosses all the red lines. I will remind you that a few years ago in Admarsha, in one of the Russian so-called semi-autonomous republics, there was another show in the circus where the trainer was dressed as a Red Army officer and a monkey was dressed as a Nazi officer, plus goats were dressed in swastikas. So, and this was sponsored, check this out, by the Russian Orthodox Church. That was before the full-scale war in Ukraine. So even at that time, some people protested that and tried to investigate whether it was illegal actually to show swastika as the Nazi symbols in Russia. So yes, they're turning every single piece of art into this kind of propaganda. And I think during the Nazis, even the Nazis didn't do it during the war. They had, I specifically looked up that they had some shows where they try to portray, of course, the Aryan race as the best. So they had like blonde, tall men taming some wild animals, but they didn't go as far as people in Russia do today. This is pretty frightening, and it's basically like everywhere. Now it's in the circus. Horrible.
Yes, and you also once said that reading Dostoevsky feels painful to you now because of his nationalism. Maybe that's exactly what we're seeing today. The old idea of Russian spiritual greatness turned into a weapon. Has 2025 become the moment when the civilized world finally admits that Russian culture is not neutral, but deeply imperial?
Yes, it is deeply imperial. Like, of course, there were like many like other cultures which used to be imperial. There was, you remember the famous poem by Rudyard Kipling, The White Man's Burden. But can you imagine, like I was thinking, can you imagine someone like Bruce Willis, who supported the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, reciting Rudyard Kipling on Fox News? Just completely unthinkable, right? But today we have Nikita Mikhalkov during the annexation of Crimea and basically the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian war in 2014. He was reading out loud a very interesting short essay by Dostoevsky, which is called Some Quite Special Remarks About the Slavs that I intended to make a long time ago. So there is a quote there: Russia never will have and never has had anyone who can hate, envy, slander, and even display open enmity toward her as much as all these Slavic tribes will the moment Russia liberates them and Europe agrees to recognize their liberation. So, like another comparison, for example, the famous composer Wagner, who has for years been banned in Israel, wrote an infamous, which is deeply, deeply anti-Semitic, Can you imagine today, like the Germans, like reciting it, reading it out loud on the German TV? So Dostoevsky, as you brought him up, yes, he has a very conflicted personality. He started as a socialist, then went a full circle, became a vehement monarchist, celebrated the conquest of Central Asia. And when he talks about Slavic tribes here, he clearly, not even mentioning Ukraine, he's talking mostly about the Slavic nations on the Balkans, which became free as the result from the Ottoman Empire, as a result of the Russo-Turkish War. Yes, they're bringing up the worst imperialist sentiments of the Russian culture. So, I mean, of course, there are like other cases, but someone like Pyotr Chadaev, who opposed Russian imperialism and started this whole movement to westernize us, would probably be in prison today. We're saying with Leo Tolstoy, who was a pacifist and anti-imperialist. So bringing up and glorifying really the most conservative monarchist like elements of the Russian literature and Russian culture.
Yes, and also the another person of art that turned into propagandist is in the mind is Mikita Mikhalkov. He just turned 80 recently, and there was a celebration of his birthday, and it looked like a religious ceremony.
In fact, it's true. It's almost religious because the patriarch personally congratulated him, and it was shown in prime time on TV. So, you know, like I would compare, I was thinking Mikhalkov with one figure in German culture. It was Wilhelm Furtwängler. That was a famous conductor. And I wrote a piece years ago when Gergiev came to Washington. I wrote a piece for the Atlantic magazine, which was called The Hero of Labor Comes to Washington, because he was one of the first heroes of labor when Putin brought back that old Soviet award. But the difference, say, between Gergiev, Mikhalkov, and Furtwängler never joined the Nazi party. And there was a discussion after the war where he was guilty. He was definitely complicit because he was the #1 top musical conductor of the Nazi era. And many American Jews after the war refused to play with him. But there's a discussion in the literature how complicit he was in the system. These guys, like Mikhalkov or Gergiev, they're tremendously complicit. I mean, Gergiev, at least he doesn't talk much about politics, but he clearly supports Putin. But Mikhalkov, he vehemently supports the war. He, as you know, with his political talk show, Bisagon TV. So, yes, it's quite a remarkable transformation about the man who actually, he never joined the Communist Party. His brother lived in the West, but he became like almost, I mean, for him, Putin is a sacred figure. I think he would be happy to crown him and make him the next czar to bring back monarchy to Russia. That's how far it goes with him today.
What he's saying about Ukraine, Mikhalkov? I mean, what he's he's approving the war, but how is he proving that? Approving.
Well, I think he says, like we talked about, this type of people, they don't see Ukraine as an independent state. They see Ukraine as a historic Russia. So another example, talking about film propaganda and Dostoevsky, there was a very, very famous TV series based on the Dostoevsky famous novel, The Idiot. It was made, I think, in 2003, and it was extremely popular. And I recently watched it. It is a very well filmed and excellent interpretation of Dostoevsky. You know that the film director, Bortko, he was born and raised in Kyiv. And he is a vehement supporter of the war. He says that the Kyiv is purely a Russian city, it needs to be brought back. There's no such thing as Ukraine. Then I started looking at the actors who played in this movie. And they were at that time in their 30s, or like most of them, the younger part of the crew. So today, all of them support the war. All of them, except maybe for one very decent and old Soviet actor who is silent today in his 90s, Oleg Basilashvili from St. Petersburg. I personally met him several times. He's clearly against the war. He just, I guess, afraid to talk about it. He doesn't want to go to prison. But all of them are in favor of the war. So yeah, this is a very tragic reality of the situation that these people, I mean, what they say basically that there is no such thing as Ukraine. This is all historic Russia. It needs to be brought back. And Mikhalkov personally just recently, I think, reiterated it, that it's basically an invented falsehood, as Solzhenitsyn called it. Ukraine, there's no such thing as Ukrainian language. There's no such thing as Ukraine. So that's what they say.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that's ideologically supported by their ideology, or that's the money they are getting from the Kremlin?
I think some of them genuinely believe that. Like a person like Mikhalkov definitely believes that. Bortko believes that. Yuri Bashmet believes that. There are many genuine supporters of Putin, and I try to explain in the West. Maybe someone like Kirkorov or some pop stars. I forgot there is this young pop star, super patriotic. So some of them, like I would think pop stars make it, a lot of them do it for money.
Yeah.
Because no one needs them in the West. Mikhalkov doesn't really need money. He has a lot of money anyway. So Bortko made several very famous films. He doesn't have to speak because there are people, I feel, who don't support the war, but they're silent because they're afraid for their careers, their families, and so forth. These people don't have to speak, and they speak genuinely. I don't think they do it for money. Those particular individuals, like Gergiev, Bortko, Mikhalkov, they believe this ideology.
That's so sad, to be honest. So
yes, it's a tragedy. I would say it's the same as in Germany. I mean, people believed in Hitler, supported Hitler. They believed in that political system. So very genuinely.
But what about the Russian opposition, like Navalny, Karamurza? That whole circle is delusional because people simply don't care. Does that mean that opposition isn't a real political force, but just a moral decoration for the West? Maybe there is no other Russia. You know, when I'm looking at them, I'm thinking maybe there is no other Russia, only, you know, milder versions of the Sun Empire.
Well, I have a hope that there is, but definitely there are not that many. So there are people, of course, the draftees who escaped from Russia, who live now like in Tbilisi or Kazakhstan. And if you look, actually, those cities are where the people with the Russian passports vote against Putin. Coming back to Karamurza and people of the Russian opposition, like, of course, some of them are very courageous people. There's no denial if Karamurza could have left like Navalny and lived in the West. He went to prison, and luckily for him, under the Biden administration, he was exchanged. So I do think I don't know him personally, like the way he sounds and talks, he sounds like a decent man, a good person, but I think these people are very delusional. And there are a few things what they're delusional about. The first one, they underestimate the genuine support for Putin by the Russian people, including even some nationalities like in the Caucasus. It's more complex there. It's a different discussion, but I myself spend a lot of time in the Caucasus, and the Russian state is really using the rivalries between those nationalities so they get support. That's, of course, not internal. That can change any day. But the Russian people at large definitely support Putin. The second thing, I think they underestimate the Russian opposition, that even many Russians living abroad support Putin. I actually looked it up. In 2024, the people with the Russian passports in Berlin voted for
Putin.
With a small percentage, but they did. That means that huge line, if you remember, they were showing on TV when actually Yulia Navalny and Kara-Murza led this line and voted themselves, I think, in that election. And Yashin and all these guys. Still, the Russian Germans voted both in Bonn and Berlin for Putin. I mean, that's the reality. I met many Russians in America who came like I did, like 30 years ago, and they support Putin today, and they don't support Ukraine. So the number third, a very serious point, which I think I particularly remember Kara-Murza getting very upset about in some of his interviews. They failed to acknowledge responsibility of the Russian people for the war. So he likes to bring Hannah Arendt, and he says, guilt versus responsibility. Yeah, we can have this academic discussion whether it's guilt or responsibility. And then he once said that the Western leaders like Angela Merkel and the people who dealt with Putin are equally responsible for the war. This is a horrid logic. It's the same like you would say, was Chamberlain and Daladier responsible for Hitler? Yes, they were complicit. And every person in France and Britain recognizes that they were complicit, particularly after the Munich Treaty, 1938. Do they carry the same responsibility as the German people for Nazism? Of course not. Is Angela Merkel complicit? Is she partially responsible for what happened? Yes, we can have the discussion. But there is no comparison with the responsibility of the population of Russia. So this is, to me, one of the biggest flaws what they have in their sort of understanding of Russia. And one final one, as Navalny actually indicated, she's vehemently opposed to any conversation about decolonization of Russia. And this is even if you read Tolstoy, he was talking about it. So the majority, some of them, like, say, Garry Kasparov, he is more open to those conversations of decolonization. But many of them, of course, for understandable reason, they don't want to talk about it. So to me, it's ironically, like you remember, there was a famous essay by Vladimir Lenin about the Russian revolutionaries in the 19th century, where he said about the Decembrists, they were too far removed from the people. So like I would say, it's the same about the Russian opposition. There are many very decent people there, but they have a very, very limited understanding of what Russia stands for today, how much Russian people support Putin. That's what they fail to understand. And they don't want to accept the responsibility of the Russian people for the war.
You touched the question of the Russian decolonization, but have you ever thinking about what's going to happen next? Will that future Russia, the Russia that will fall apart, will be a safer, better world with a democracy?
Well, it's a very difficult question. I personally believe that the future, and I wrote about it, the future of more of a peaceful Russia is definitely in decolonized Russia. So the future is in the development of regional identities. They don't have to be necessarily ethnic identities. Siberia had several independent movements. The first big one was in 1860s, and that came from the ethnic Russians. The same was in the 1990s in the Urals. You remember that there was an attempt to create a Uralian republic with a capital in Yekaterinburg. So I think as we see in the history of Russia, as soon as this dictatorship, a very authoritarian rule ends and Moscow becomes weak, there are all these movements for separatism. So I do believe it's possible, and I do believe it will happen one day, but it's only possible with this disintegration and the development of local regional identities, which are there. I know for sure because I talked even from like Russian speaking, totally like ethnically Russian people from Siberia. They have their own identity. They very often say, even in the United States, you say, well, you're Russian. They say, oh, well, I am, but I'm from Siberia. So the idea of Siberiak in Russian is actually very unique in a sense that it doesn't have an ethnic connotation. So you can be like of any linguistic, ethnic background. So like in the long term, like I'm optimistic that it's possible because all empires collapse. Can you imagine like the Ottoman Empire, Turkey becoming democratic without falling apart, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire? So one day it will happen. When? It's very difficult to predict, definitely not under Putin.
Yes, and just to follow up on that one, if culture, is there any chance that culture will not justify by violence? And, you know, can there be a culture without empire, without myth, without a cult of death?
Well, you need to reconcile, yes, to digest your culture. As I gave you examples from, say, the British culture, which had empire embedded in it, which German culture, which has deep anti-Semitism in their culture, and also the culture of cultural superiority. Is Nietzsche responsible for Nazism? All these ideas, very conservative ideas. Germans today are handling it, though there are frightening tendencies, both in like Anglo-American world and the German world, Hungary, with the revival of this kind of nationalism, imperialism. I do think it's possible, but empire needs to collapse. And then you read Dostoevsky and enjoy his characters and not his diaries. You enjoy his psychological dramas, but not his notes like on the conquest of Central Asia. So
Yeah,
I'm
was
cautiously optimistic.
yes. You know, I was recalling the quote from Ukrainian historian Yaroslav Hrytsak. He's from Western Ukraine, from Lviv, and once he said that the empires collapsing are not unnoticeable, so it's just happening very quickly.
Well, if you think the Russian Empire collapsed in 92 times, right? In 1917,
right. Yes.
it happened very fast. It happened very fast. And in 1991, like I was in the Soviet Union at that time, the most ludicrous thing to me when Putin said that it was the biggest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, I remember that day so well. I was very politically engaged. I supported Perestroika, Mikhail Gorbachev, then Yeltsin, and so forth. And I remember the date, the 31st of December, when the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Not a single person in the entirety of the Soviet Union went to demonstrate and say, no, we need to save this country. So that happened just like in a matter of days, right? And that can happen. On that, I actually, like, I agree with Karamurza. Karamurza believes that he will go back one day. So, I mean, Solzhenitsyn believed that too, and people were laughing at him. I think Karamurza may have a point. I also believe I may be able to go at least visit one day because Putin will die before me. I hope so. And the new person is unlikely. Maybe in the short term it will become worse and then better, but I don't think his system will exist for a very long period of time.
Yeah, you're right. People who's living outside of Ukraine have much more chances to see when people will die rather than people in Ukraine. But that's just, a dark humor. Peter, thank you so much for your time. Yes,
it was a great pleasure again talking to you.
Thank you so much. It's so every time I have such a lot of insights from you and perspectives and just the facts about our history. So thank you so much for that, and that you're telling that to our audience.
Thank you. And слава Україні.
Героям слава.